Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Everyone, welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. We're here today with Andrew Nagorski to discuss his latest book, Saving Freud, The Rescuers Who Brought Him to Freedom. It's published by Simon & Schuster. It'll be released on the 23rd of August, when it'll be on the front table at our bookstore, Wellington Square Bookshop. Andrew spent more than 3 decades as a foreign correspondent and editor for Newsweek. He was vice president and director of public policy for the East-West Institute, an international affairs think tank. Some of his previous works, many of them focusing on Germany, World War II, and Hitler, include Hitlerland, The Greatest Battle, his novel, Last Stop Vienna, and almost nostalgically in these days, Reluctant Farewell, an American reporter's candid look inside the Soviet Union. So, Sigmund Freud. The name conjures a name, a face, and lots of memes, I guess they would call them now, a couch, a beard, an accent. And of course, it also begins with a thought process that takes us from Vienna to psychoanalysis, to projection, to transference, to sex. But the vast majority of us do not think of an Austria after an Anschluss, a family afraid for their possessions and lives, and a patriarch in denial. So the story that stems from there is one of stealth, intrigue, and a lot of help from some devoted friends, colleagues, and family. So on March 15th, 1938, a clock began to tick, and I'll hand over that day to Andrew to tell us about this amazing story. So welcome, Andrew, and thanks so much.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. And yes, the clock began to tick. That's the culmination of the story I try to tell in the book. It's an intriguing question why Freud was still there in the first place, because here it wasn't as if the rise of Hitler at that point was a secret. He had taken power in Germany in 1933. The Anschluss, his incorporation of Austria into the Third Reich, takes place in 1938, and many Austrian Jews had already fled, but Freud was still there. He was at that point 81 years old. He had cancer of the jaw. He was a man who had spent his entire life, except for the first 4 years, in Vienna. Loved the city, loved his life there, his rituals. That Freud, while he was considered to be a revolutionary thinker for his time, was a man of habit, tradition in terms of his personal life. And so he's very reluctant to leave and kept hoping that somehow this horror that was happening in Germany would not overwhelm Austria. And it would take, as you mentioned, a group of very devoted friends and followers to extricate him after Hitler had already shown up practically next door to him, giving a speech just a short way away from his apartment and office. So the story I try to tell is what happens on that day, and then how it got to that day. And if you look at that day in particular, here Hitler has arrived. He's given a speech in Vienna, saying this is basically Austria no longer exists. It's simply the eastern flank of the Third Reich. And at the same time, the groups of Nazi thugs start showing up, especially in the apartments and offices of Jews in Vienna who are well known. And nobody was better known in that day than Sigmund Freud. So you have a group of Nazi thugs who showed up first at his publishing house. He had a publishing house just down the street from his office, or just up the street from his office, actually, which was called the International Psychoanalytic Press. And his oldest son was there. And these guys came in and started looting it, trying to find money, anything valuable. They held his son Martin at gunpoint. And pretty soon, another group shows up at the apartment where Freud has both his residence and his office. And Martha Freud sees what's happening. She opens up the door and she has a presence of mind to act like the very gracious hostess. She says, "Oh, won't the gentleman come in? And perhaps you would like some of the money we have here that's on the table." And so she gives what money there is. These thugs are a little bit thrown off, but you know their mission is obviously to grab what they can. And then Anna Freud, their youngest daughter, who is still living at home. The Freuds had 6 kids, but only Anna was still at home. She herself would one day become one of the most famous psychoanalysts, a child psychoanalyst in the world. She goes, brings these thugs back to another room where there's a safe, and pulls out the equivalent of roughly $840, which is a tremendous amount of money in those days. And again, just offers them. And at that point, suddenly Freud, who is sick and ailing, and both his wife and his daughter had tried to screen him from what was happening, he shows up in the room, doesn't say anything, but he's rather this looming figure. And even the Nazi thugs knew who he was. And he just fixes them with this stony look, and they decide, okay, that's it. They say, well, we'll be back for more later. And they back out of the apartment and say, Herr Professor, Mr. Professor, we'll be back later. And that's the beginning of a drama, which then goes on for a couple of months.
Well, you know, as a bookseller, it's kind of an occupational hazard, but obviously and every customer is always concerned with a cover and a title and an epigraph. And in this epigraph, your hero and mine, for whom the book, The World of Yesterday, really kind of changed our lives, is a beautiful book and a wonderful story of a man and a wife that ends tragically. But if you have the book there, that's another thing a bookseller says, hold it up so everyone can see the cover if you have it. And then also if you could read the epigraph, because it goes to this idea of a man who's so intelligent, but so in denial, and it harkens to our present time as well.
Yes. Well, first of all, here's the book. and the epigraph, which you mentioned, it's not only I chose it for the epigraph, but actually the reason that beautiful memoir of Stefan Zweig, who was this Austrian Jewish writer at the turn of the century, who was probably the most most popular writer at the time. He's not as well remembered then, but he wrote novellas and plays and short stories, and he was extremely talented. And then he wrote this beautiful memoir, as you say, called The World of Yesterday. And when I was looking for a topic for my next book, I was reading that memoir. And that's what got me going, because Zweig, who was Austrian Jewish, in 1934, decides to get out of Austria. He realizes early, this is going to end badly here too. We can't pretend what's happening in Germany is not going to happen. And in his memoir, he describes meeting Freud in Vienna, getting to know him, his impressions of him. And the next time he sees him, it's in London in 1938 when Freud finally gets out. And then I'm thinking, there is a story here. Why was Freud still in Vienna 4 years after Zweig and so many others fled? And then how did he get out? So, but to read the epigram, it's the way it reads, it is an iron law of history that those who will be caught up in the great movements determining the course of their own times always fail to recognize them in their early stages.
And you know, the thing about it is the way he says it's an iron law. There's no play in it. And the reason, I'm not putting words in your mouth, these are my words. The reason why this is so poignant now is because we may be in one of the early stages of those things in which we are denial. And you worked at Newsweek for so long, you may disagree with me, you may not. But the point I'm trying to make is that Stefan Zweig and Freud were contemporaries. They exchanged correspondence. They're both incredibly intelligent. Here's one man who gets the hell out of there and then is so depressed by the situation he perceives is that he ends he and his wife end their lives. But then Freud, what was going on psychologically with him that precluded the ability to understand the severity and how grave his situation might be?
Right. I mean, Freud was, first of all, he was fairly apolitical. He was so focused on psychoanalysis that he tried to stay in his own world. It wasn't that he did not understand politics. He understood a lot about politics, and he wrote a wonderful essay, a long extended essay, which was a book called Civilization and Its Discontents in 1930, which really talked about the savagery of man. It was based on his observations during World War I, his disillusionment with what had happened in World War I, and then his fears given the rise of totalitarianism in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany. So he wasn't naive in a theoretical level, but he was somewhat naive personally, or like a lot of us, I think, when you're faced in a situation where suddenly the whole world may change around you and all your assumptions about life may change. You're very reluctant to admit that. And I was lucky enough to be a foreign correspondent on the other side of what we used to call the Iron Curtain, in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Hungary, and in the Soviet Union in the 80s. And you could see that while a lot of people realize at some point there's going to be a reckoning and this system may not make it, but there's still kind of the assumption that the world we grew up in some form is going to stay the way it is, whether you like it or not. And I think all of us find it hard to imagine. And I was talking to actually a British psychiatrist recently who had read an advanced copy of my book, and he said he was fascinated by that aspect, but he said, look, it's like my fellow psychiatrist, in a way, I'm not surprised that Freud was in denial, and he was so smart and incisive about so many things. It's like the psychoanalyst who can identify your problems or my problems, but within his own family, it's a total mess. And it's a little bit like that.
It's the cobbler whose children have no shoes, or me as an
yes,
attorney,
absolutely,
not having a will.
Right.
Yeah, it's funny though, when you had this moment of epiphany of sorts with reading Zweig's book, which many times I've actually had dreams about it, which Freud could analyze. But
yes, I was going to say, do you want me to analyze those?
Well, you don't want to hear it? Okay. I had this dream about a guy named Robert Zweig, and it was like he was going to be very important in my life. And I searched and searched and searched, and I couldn't find one. But then I found Stefan Zweig, and then I read The World of Yesterday. But I still don't know where the word Zweig came.
Yeah, I mean, Zweig, there was actually in Freud's world, there was Stefan Zweig, and there was also an Arnold Zweig who was a pretty well-known Austrian writer too. So it's not that uncommon a name.
I think he had a correspondence with Arnold, but it's like he kind of put Arnold off, like he didn't really want to keep up with cars. Well, so what made you decide? I mean, the story is great. It's cinematic. It's a movie. It could be one of your novels. But what made you decide to expand it to a biography of the man as well as the story of escape?
Well, the more I got into it, I started reading about Freud's life, his views, his evolution. I realized that you always have a bit of hesitation tackle the life of somebody who is as well known as Freud. You think, what is there new that I can provide? And like a lot of people, I thought I had a pretty good idea of who he was and a little bit about his theories. I took Psych 101 in college, after all. But when I started reading about him, first of all, I was fascinated to discover how much evidence there is, contemporary evidence about how he felt and who was he interacting with. Because Freud wrote letters and exchanged letters with everybody. It's a gift to anybody writing a biography or a period piece to have that mountain of correspondence, whether it was 900 letters to Martha, his wife, with who he was engaged for 4 years before they felt they had the means to marry, or then to all sorts of other people. And I became intrigued by him and by this group of people around him, some of whom Stefan Zweig alluded to in his memoir, but others I came across. And I thought, in order to understand him, it's really a way of retelling the story of Freud and this circle of friends, how it developed. They didn't just suddenly show up in 1938. These were friendships and relationships that dated back to the earliest days of psychoanalysis, when Freud was just beginning to become known, but was still seen in the early days often as a bit of a strange character who for instance, the Vienna medical establishment at first thought, this guy's a little bit kooky. He's not following the rules, the script we have. What is all this stuff about subconscious and sexual urges and all this? There was a real reluctance to accept his theories. So I felt, and the more I read and discovered his thought processes, his correspondence, also I found his personality fascinating, because it was this mixture, as I mentioned before, of someone who had really an ability to challenge contemporary thinking and be unconventional, but had this very conventional life. He married early, had 6 kids, lived his whole life in very rigid kind of habits. When he got up in the morning, had breakfast, and then when he did his walks around the Ringstrasse, this horseshoe-shaped boulevard in Vienna, when he dropped in on the cafes, how he met people, of course, how he smoked his cigars, where he got his cigars, all those things. And I became intrigued by his personality, because he's often seen as a very dour personality in the image. But in fact, I found that he had incredible dry wit at times. And he was capable of making fun gently of himself. One of my favorite little stories was when an American, Joseph Wartis, a young American studying to be a psychiatrist, came to Freud and to be psychoanalyzed by him as part of his training, which was a number of people did that who wanted to move into that field. And usually Freud would be sitting during their sessions, and his dog, he was very dog obsessed, which was something I identified with too, would be sitting quietly somewhere in the room. In one of these sessions, they closed the door. Turned out the dog was outside and started scratching on the door. So Freud lets the dog in, and the dog promptly plops down and starts licking her private parts. And Freud tries to get her to stop, and he can't get her to stop. And he finally tells to this American who's studying with him, it's just like with people. You can't get them to stop that stuff.
Yeah, we can't actually anatomically do it, which would really screw things up.
Yeah.
So, we ought to get to, because there's a bunch of them, the panoply of characters.
Right.
I wanted to start with Ernest Jones, because boy, would that guy be canceled today? He had so many, there's no way he'd be around. He wouldn't get another movie role forever.
No, Ernest Jones was a fascinating character. And he's, by the way, he was one of Freud's earliest disciples in Britain. He was a Welshman who studied medicine, and at a very young age becomes intrigued about what he starts hearing about this man Freud in Vienna. And in fact, at that point, this is about 1908, Freud's writings, most of them have not been translated into English; they're in German. And Jones, who is a very good student, a brilliant man, has studied some German, but decides to actually get a German tutor so that he can read Freud in the only language available at the time, in German. And he becomes more and more convinced, as he said, that here's a man who actually listens to his patients, who looks for clues, not like in the medical profession in those days, there was a sense that the doctor, whether it was a psychiatrist or any other kind of doctor, would tell the patient what they should think or do. He said Freud is really listening to his patients, and so Jones is this intense young man interested in it, becomes obsessed with psychoanalysis and wants to learn more. And by the way, he's a very small man. He's 5'4", but as one of his female colleagues said, he was irresistible to women. And every time he gets a job as a young doctor, there's some sort of scandal, someone accusing him of sexual abuse or inappropriate this, that, or the other. As you say, in today's world, he would not have survived for long. And in fact, at one point, he decides he has to move to Canada, take a job in Canada, because he can't find anyone to employ him in London because his reputation is so shaky. But Freud is entranced by the guy who comes. He first goes to Carl Jung, one of Freud's early partners, who soon breaks with Freud. And Jung then connects him with Freud, and he becomes as if the apostle of psychoanalysis in the English-speaking world. And later he becomes the president of the International Psychoanalytical Association. And you have to remember, with Freud, he was what he called himself. He almost called himself a fisher of men, which is a very almost biblical, Christ-like statement. But he had this idea that I've got to spread the word about this. And Jones was his most fervent man to spread the word. And Freud felt all these accusations against Jones, well, this is transference in psychoanalytical terms, that patients often see things and develop romantic notions about their psychoanalysts and fantasies. And they shouldn't be, that shouldn't shake your confidence in the psychoanalyst.
Well, let's let that be, because now, when, like I said, about being a bookseller, if this book ever, and it probably will, become part of our nonfiction or memoir biography book club, there'll be people on either side of the table, either taking Jones's side or eviscerating him. So I'll leave that for them.
Yeah, well, let them go at it.
Yeah, that's the best part of a book club, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, we could spend the day on Freud and Jung, but this is not the time for that. But I'd love to do that sometime.
Okay.
And then I guess we should move on to the characters, because one of the most fascinating ones is Madame Bonaparte, who is, as it sounds, the great-grandniece of Napoleon.
Yes. I mean, that's the other thing about, if you devised kind of an imaginary cast, you couldn't come up with more connections. Here is Marie Bonaparte, whose great uncle was Napoleon. Her great grandfather was Napoleon's brother, Lucien Bonaparte. And she grew up in this Bonaparte family, very protected. Her mother had died early. Her father is very cold and worried that somebody's going to try to take advantage of her because of her name, and they have some real money in the family for a variety of reasons. And then she marries the Prince of Greece and Denmark. This is the royalty, and in Europe is always complicated. So she becomes the Princess of Greece and Denmark, lives in Paris, and it's a fairly, let us say, a laissez-faire marriage, in the sense that she has numerous affairs, including with top French politicians like Aristide Briand, who was prime minister several times. But she has sexual problems. She considers herself frustrated, quote unquote, frigid, and she seeks out Freud's help to deal with this. And she first is psychoanalyzed by somebody else, and then she gets an introduction to Freud. And Freud is is very soon really taken with her. And this becomes a lifetime relationship that is more, she not only starts out as a patient, but then she also becomes a psychoanalyst herself. She becomes a major support of his psychoanalytical movement in terms of both contributing articles, lectures, and so forth, but contributing money, which helps, for instance, the psychoanalytic press survive the Depression, and then plays a key role when it's time to get Freud out, because the Nazis, what are they after if they are in those early days, if they're going to let a prominent Jew out of Vienna, they want, in effect, ransom money.
Hey, you could call this whole group of characters, horrible pun, but the group of them you could call the Napoleonic complex.
Yeah, that's a good one. I didn't think of that, but that's pretty good.
The other guy who is a really nice guy is, I think he's a nice guy, is William Bullitt.
Yeah, well,
Tell us about-
Bullitt is a very interesting character too. He's from an old Philadelphia family. At a very young age, he becomes a famous journalist in the United States for one of the Philadelphia papers. And he also writes a novel that does very well. And then he becomes part of President Wilson's peace delegation to Europe at the end of World War I. He's filled with this idealism that he's going to be part of this movement to bring peace to Europe. And he wants to bring peace with the new authorities in Moscow, the Bolsheviks, Lenin, and he's actually sent on a mission as a very young man to try to negotiate with Lenin. But then Wilson and everybody else disavows him because they're worried about the backlash of any deal with this new communist regime. He becomes very embittered, quits the peace mission and goes back to writing. And then he also has his own love life gets more complicated. He goes through a divorce. Then he marries the widow of John Reed, who was the famous American radical who went to observe the Russian Revolution and wrote 10 Days That Shook the World. I'm sure you've got that in your bookstore. And yeah, and the widow, Louise Branson, is someone who has a drinking problem and other issues. And eventually Bullock goes to meet Freud, and a very unlikely thing happens. Now, they discuss his personal issues, his sexual issues, and so forth. But Freud, who has heard of Bullock, who made a name for himself so early, discovers that Bullock is working on a group biography of the leaders in Versailles, the top world leaders of Wilson, of Clemenceau, of all the top leaders. And they discovered that they both hate Woodrow Wilson. They both think, Freud, who had been a very Austro-Hungarian Empire, a patriot, holds Wilson responsible for what he views as the disastrous terms of the Versailles Peace Treaty at the end of World War I. Yep. So does Bullock. And Freud says, when he learns of this, he said, "I'll help you write the chapter on Woodrow Wilson, and we'll share that." And Bullock is stunned, because Freud by that time is already very famous, and decides, well, if we're going to do that, let's make the whole book Freud and my book about Woodrow Wilson. And they work on this. The book was not a very big success, and there were all sorts of problems. Goes back into diplomacy, and the Roosevelt administration first becomes the first US ambassador to the Soviet Union when we recognize the Soviet Union in 1933. And then he becomes ambassador to France. And that's where he is in the late 30s when the Anschluss happens, when Hitler is taking over Austria. And he makes sure that there's someone in the US mission in Vienna who is monitoring what the Nazis are doing to Freud, because at that point, there's still the assumption that Hitler does not want to antagonize the US too much. And he's still trying to pretend he can be reasonable. And so Bullock makes sure that every step of the way, when Freud and his family and so forth are being monitored, interrogated, and so forth, that the U.S. Embassy actually sends a car with American flags to right in front of their house. So the message is clear: we don't want something bad happen to Freud. So Bullock is a key figure here as well. He's also friends with Marie Bonaparte in Paris, since he's the ambassador in Paris. And so this circle is pretty tight.
Yeah, and that's a good, well, we'll get to Dr. Shure, but that's a good opening for the mechanics of what happened. But we can't not talk about Anna and how important Anna was, not only as taking care, almost a governess caretaker for Freud in the latter years, but also essentially his favorite child in a lot of ways, and also a psychoanalyst in her own right.
Right. Yes. Anna Freud, as I mentioned, the Freuds had 6 kids quite quickly after they were married, and Anna was the youngest. And as all the other kids grew up and then left the house, even some of them stayed in Vienna, but somewhere elsewhere, Anna stayed there. And she stayed with her parents. And as Freud was getting older and then having his problems, which began in 1923 with the discovery of the cancer in his jaw, which was the product of his cigar smoking, Anna became, as you say, not just the one child in the house. She took over his day-to-day personal care and made sure everything he did was he was protected as much as possible. And she was also closest to him professionally, because she immediately, even as a young teenager, took interest in psychoanalysis, in her father's ideas. She would sit in on these Wednesday evening sessions of what they call the Vienna Psychoanalytical Society, which happened in Freud's quarters. And she was curious about everything. And one of my favorite anecdotes is when Freud is taking her around a part of Vienna where there's some very nice homes, the Prater district. And when she was about 14, and Freud turns to Anna and says, "You see these nice homes? They have beautiful facades. But what's behind those facades is not necessarily beautiful." And he said, it's the same thing with human beings. He had a great teaching method, very simple analogies like that. And Anna was totally devoted to him. And because she was so devoted to him, this becomes a key factor in Freud's eventual decision to give up his reluctance to leave Vienna, because he knows, he feels I'm near the end of my life. I have very little time left. But Anna won't leave without me. And she's got a lot of time left if she can get out. So we have to go.
We should take an aside, because people don't understand, I think, the length of time that Freud suffered from the cancer, which was hard. I can't even imagine living through this. But a couple of things. One, again, the denial part.
Yeah.
I always thought someone should psychoanalyze the fact that in every picture he makes sure that his cigar is showing and pointing in a specific direction at times. Yeah. And in addition to that, shouldn't he have known? Well, this is just me rambling, but the point is, let's talk about the cancer, the fact that he had this prosthetic device at the end. You even talk, and it's morbid kind of, about the odor, and his dog wouldn't even hang out with him. But it went on for years and years and years, like 38 different procedures and failed procedures.
About 15 years from the time the cancer was diagnosed until actually maybe 16, and he dies. And it was painful. And various physicians and friends tell them to stop smoking cigars. And he made a few attempts to at least cut down. But as he told, I think actually told Ernest Jones, where they went back and forth about this in some of their correspondence, he said, in order to write and to think, I have to smoke. And he was always writing and thinking, so it was something he associated. He had this idea in his mind that without the cigar, he would not be capable of producing what he wanted to produce, and he always wanted to produce more. He always had an ambition to get one more study in, one more book, one more real essay that explains this or that subject that he's fascinated by. And his interests were wide ranging. He was interested in antiquities, as evidenced by all the statuettes in his office. And I was just recently in London, in his last house in London. It's just full of this stuff, since they managed to get quite a bit of it out. And you know, he was interested by Moses and the story of Moses, and came up with his own ideas, somewhat quirky about that. But of course, but mainly psychoanalytic theory, and he wanted to keep writing. And yes, he made these attempts, but he also said his attitude seemed to be, I want to live my life the way I can still enjoy my life, even if I know part of that life is inflicting pain that will eventually end it.
Jeez. You know, taking another brief digression, when you're talking about antiquities, you could talk about where his remains now lay and reside, and how they got there and who gave it. That's an interesting story.
Yes. Yeah. Well, his remains are, when they do get to London, this team manages to get him out. And the details I'll leave for the book, but he wants to. The decision was to be cremated, and his remains are in Golders Green, which is a cemetery crematorium in London, and it's there with his wife Martha, who outlived him quite a bit until she died in, I think, 1950. But they're kept in a Greek urn, which was given to him by Marie Bonaparte.
It's fascinating, and I forgot to tell you, or my readers or listeners, about the excellent photographs in here and illustrations and stuff like that. That, you know, make a difference.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I found it wonderful, and one of the
archive.
Yeah, I mean, there were some wonderful photos early on, some taken by one of his actually relatives, a photographer who was married to the one daughter who died young from Spanish flu. But also, it's interesting, one character we haven't talked about is his personal physician, Max Shure. And it's interesting that most of what I call the rescue squad are Gentiles. They're not Jews. They're, you know, Bullock and Bonaparte and Jones are not. And Freud, in fact, was very concerned early on when he was starting this whole psychoanalytic movement, that the people around his table in Vienna, most of them were from the Jewish community. And he said, that's fine, but I am aware of the anti-Semitism that resides in this part of the world. And we don't want this labeled a quote unquote Jewish science. And so that's one of the reasons why he first brought in someone like Jung and then Ernest Jones. And he welcomed others because he wanted it not to be identified as a Jewish science. For Freud himself never denied his Jewish heritage. He was an atheist. He was not an observant Jew. And he just wanted to do what he felt was practical for his science. Max Shure, however, who I consider also part of this rescue squad, was a Jewish doctor in Vienna, much younger than Freud. He had first treated Marie Bonaparte when she was visiting Vienna. And Marie Bonaparte was intrigued by this young doctor who told her that she had gone to Freud's lectures as a medical student at the University of Vienna and was fascinated by psychoanalysis, even though he was not a psychoanalyst himself. And when Marie Bonaparte became more concerned about all the health problems Freud was having, he recommended to Freud, you need one doctor to sort of coordinate your care, because up to that point, various doctors had dealt with various parts of his ailments. He also complained about his heart and other things. And she urged him to meet this young doctor, Max Shure. He takes him on, they become very close. And he really helps keep Freud going. But he also, very interestingly enough, one of the terms of his employment when Freud takes him on, it's 1929, so 10 years before he dies, he says to Shure, he's already been sick for quite a while with the cancer, and says, at a certain point, if this becomes unbearable for me, the pain becomes unbearable, you have to promise me you'll help me end it. And if you agree to that, I want you as my doctor. And that's Shure agreed, and eventually he did. He helped him end his life in 1939.
Those last days when Freud basically says it's time, but double check with Anna before you do it. But and so they give him these doses of morphine that eventually do the trick. But what happened afterwards with this controversy about, was Shure there? Was he not there? Isn't there some kind of like?
No, there was no real controversy. What's interesting, the other story about Shure, which again shows his devotion to his patient, was that Shure, like some of the other people like Stefan Zweig we talked about, realized earlier than Freud himself the danger that Austrian Jews were in. And in 1937, he's already been Freud's doctor for a long time. He makes arrangements. He has at that point a wife and 2 young children. And he decides to apply for American visas because he was born in part, it's complicated. He was part in pre-World War I Austro-Hungarian Empire that was part of Poland and later on. And he manages to get through what is called the Polish quota of US visas, get visas for himself and his family. He could have left before the Anschluss, but because Freud refuses to leave, he puts all that on hold. And you can say he took a risk with himself and his own family. And he goes to London, continues caring for Freud. But once they get to London, he feels Freud is safe. He gets another doctor to look after him for a while. He says, I'm going to go to the States for a while just to get all my paperwork in order, because if I don't, I've pushed it off too long. The Americans might cancel my permission to come to the States and also to recertify as a doctor there. So he leaves him in London for a while. And by the time, it's of course by ship and it takes a while, but if Freud helps him with his connections to get through the bureaucracy as fast as possible, and Shure gets back to help with Freud in his final months. But so it was nothing mysterious about it. It was just that he felt he did have to take care of his own family, but he risked everything to stay with Freud.
Yeah, and he came back right away. You know, I'm going to London on Friday, and I realize it's 7 hours, and I'm thinking that's a long time, and I'm going, no, think of John Adams going to The Hague and coming back, and
oh yes,
how you had to have a lot of strength mentally and physically to do that back then.
Yes, yeah, and remember also, this is when this happening, the war is closing in, and it's about to drag Britain into the war too. So the war was very close. So, but yeah, all the conditions were quite different. I just flew back from London a couple of days ago. So yes, it's if we complain about cramped flights and a little bit of discomfort, I think we should keep things in perspective.
Yeah, it's a good rule not to take anything that we have right now for granted and to live in the moment, especially in these times. Yeah, it's fascinating that we've talked about the people and kind of the process, but as we conclude, talk about the mechanics. And I know you said you'll leave it to the readers, but just a bit about the physical mechanics of picking him up, putting him in something, and moving him from place to place.
Right. Well, then I'll just add one more thing about one more person we haven't mentioned. Yeah, right. And that is what's really extraordinary about this. You have these people dedicated to Freud. And then every sort of prominent Jewish family in Vienna was assigned a Nazi overseer, a trustee, they called him. And the Nazis at that point weren't yet quite sure, what are they going to do with people like Freud? This is before the death camps and all that, but the anti-Semitism was part of the program. And it wasn't clear whether they would just immediately imprison them? Would they just strip them of their wealth, allow them to emigrate? And a lot depended on who was assigned to oversee one of these families. And the man who was assigned to oversee the Freuds was a man named Anton Sauervald. He was a 35-year-old Nazi, but educated at the university in Vienna in chemistry. And he came in spewing anti-Semitic remarks, being sounding very nasty. But as he sat in the Freud house and office, he began reading some of Freud's works and was quite impressed by them. And it turned out he had also studied under a Jewish professor in the 20s, a chemistry professor who had been a friend of Freud, and who had since died. And he kind of identified Freud with this professor who he actually liked. And eventually, so Freud's fate was in his hands to a large extent. And as they were interrogating members of his family, particularly Anna, who took on the business of trying to fight through the Nazi bureaucracy and find out what's the ransom that they really want, how can we negotiate this? He discovered something that could have sealed Freud's fate, and that is that he had foreign bank accounts, which before the Nazis took over was perfectly legal. And since Freud had patients, particularly from Britain and the United States, it was not surprising that he had bank accounts in other currencies. But the Nazis made that completely illegal, and they could have used that as an excuse to never let him out. But he concealed that from his superiors just long enough for him to get out. So there were two things that they needed. They needed the Nazis' approval, and that meant paying an exorbitant, what they called flight tax, based on a very liberal assessment of all his wealth, which came to about $50,000 in those days, which was a huge sum. And then they say 1/4 of that is going to be taxed. So in other words, about $12,000, which again is a huge sum. You have to multiply that several times over. And Freud didn't have that kind of cash on hand. And Marie Bonaparte supplied most of it. William Bullock was backing her up if he needed it. And then the other thing was to get entry permits for Freud and his entourage to Britain, which was the place he really wanted to go. But Britain, like most countries in those days, was already very reluctant to accept Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, and even very famous ones. And it was Ernest Jones who went back and pulled every connection he had in London to make sure they all got entry permits. So, and then they had to physically got them on the train. And oh, by the way, one other thing, the Nazis, once everything was taken care of allegedly, and the Nazis had been paid off, they brought a statement to Freud, this Nazi official, saying, "Yeah, I've been treated well. The new authorities of the Third Reich have treated me with respect and dignity and all this." And Freud knew he had to sign it. There was no choice in the matter if he wanted to get out. So he signed it. And then he turned to this official and said, "Oh, by the way, do you mind if I add one thing?" He said, "I'd recommend the Gestapo to anyone." This Nazi official just turned on his heel and got out of there. So even in those conditions, Freud could show his wry sense of humor.
I was hoping I could ask that question before you actually said it, because it was really funny. I highly recommend Nazi.
Yeah, yes, and the Gestapo.
Yeah. I feel remiss because Sauer is, the rest of them were big helpers, but without him, none of it could have happened.
Yes, yeah. I mean, if it had been a different Nazi official in charge, this story might have ended very badly. And by the way, the other thing is, if you say, well, it couldn't happen to a Freud, well, 4 of Freud's sisters remained in Vienna. And it's a little unclear. Probably there wasn't the time to try to get him out. I think they also were probably reluctant to leave and felt the sisters were just not that well known, even though we share our brother's last name. And Freud left a good deal of money for them, so thinking that so that they could survive. But those 4 sisters who got out all died in the Holocaust, and that tells you this is, what was happening. This was not a pretend threat. This was a very real threat.
Oh, and the other aspect of how gargantuan a task was it is they had a list of people. It wasn't just Freud.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
how many people were 14? More.
Oh, yeah. They were actually, in the end, there were 24 people got out.
Wow.
And as part of this thing, all arranged the entry permits by Ernest Jones. So it's Freud's immediate family. There was the doctor and his family, and a few and some associated people. So it was incredible that they all did. They didn't all get out at the same time, but they pretty much got the permission at the same time.
It's interesting how no matter how you live or who you are, how famous or how much money you have, in the end, it's the people around you who really decide your fate in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and that's what also motivated me to do this book, because I just found this circle of friends and intimates who then save him. Each one of them could be a fascinating subject for a book.
And it was. And thank you so much today for joining us. We've been talking with Andrew Nagorski regarding Saving Freud, the rescues who brought him to freedom. As I said, it's published by Simon & Schuster. It's going to be released on the 23rd of this month and promptly placed on our front table. And Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really wonderful talk, especially since we started out with Stefan Zweig for both of us.
Yes, yes. If you start with Stefan Zweig, then I think we're off on the right direction. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.